Oh. Dear Eric, I convey the Honorable Minister's sincerest apologies as he is unable to participate in this afternoon's discussions. He was called to an executive management meeting, which is a statutory meeting chaired by the President. Apologies again, and thanks for understanding. Regards, Coffee Ennen. Well, at least we got a response, and it's a nice excuse to say that he was called by the President for a meeting. So I know we're going to start in about 3 minutes. For the questions, some of those questions I might ask you as in a grouping, but then some I might do then a follow-up question. So it won't be more than 2, if that makes sense. And then you would just be the person that would be asked. So for example, Patricia, I'll ask you, first about the concerns from developing countries and is debt relief important? Then you would respond to that, and then I would immediately follow up and say, what are the motivations from civil society to organize today's event? Does that make sense?
So for each speaker, you would like to separate the questions?
Would you prefer me just to ask all the questions just first, or would you like me to split them up to you? What would be your preference?
I think all in once to take less time.
Okay. That's fine with me. So I'll just ask them, I'll just do an overview once with the questions.
Patricia. Good morning.
Hola, Omar.
Patricia. Hola.
Sí.
¿Empezamos a transmitir ahora? Ya son las 9:01.
Yes. So should we start? It's 10 and 1 minute.
Tú me indicas si empiezo a transmitir.
So, Eric, are we okay to start?
Yes. Wonderful. It's so good to see our wonderful group of panelists today. We'd like to welcome everyone for joining this critical conversation.
Eric, sorry.
It's okay. Ya puede empezar en ese instante.
Welcome. We're waiting a few moments as people are logging on. We're very excited. More than 350 people have registered for today's critical conversation and discussion on special drawing rights and zero debt solutions. Welcome. We're waiting a few moments. Welcome everyone to today's very important webinar sponsored by Afrodad, Eurodad, Latindadd, and Jubilee USA Network. We're convening this conversation at a critical moment as world leaders, the IMF, the G20, the United Nations make critical and urgent decisions about the global economic crisis and the health and economic impacts of the coronavirus. Just yesterday, the International Monetary Fund, who already said the current economic crisis caused by the coronavirus rivals the Great Depression, the International Monetary Fund noted and reported yesterday, even as some economies are reopening, the situation is worse than they had originally predicted. Right now, world leaders have tried to act quickly to deal with this great economic crisis, to deal with the health impacts that too many countries are dealing with. Right now, out of the 77 poorest countries in the world, IDA countries, International Development Association countries, the lucky ones before the coronavirus hit had 50 critical care units. Many had zero. As this crisis has emerged and the analysis has come out from world leaders, from the UN Conference on Trade and Development, from the International Labor Organization, the statistics have continued to become more concerning. Right now, the International Labor Organization notes that 300 million jobs because of this crisis will be permanently destroyed. To put that in perspective to the great financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, in the 4 years that followed that very significant crisis, we lost 22 million jobs. And now 300 million jobs are predicted to be lost. There's a great urgency among the poorest countries in the world, developing countries and middle-income countries, as the newest reports say that 265 million new people will face hunger and extreme famine issues because of the crisis. The reality is that we also will see more than 100 million people enter the ranks of extreme poverty, including in middle-income countries around the world. The reality is that as world leaders and civil society, the United Nations, the IMF have tried to act quickly, we have to ask, have we done enough? And the answer in short is no. But the reality is there are solutions on the table, not only to deal with these extreme issues of famine, to deal with the extreme issues of inequality, but also to allow countries to emerge with more resilience after this crisis. For countries in our world to emerge in a world where we protect our planet and we ensure that all people have enough. That's what today's conversation is about. It's looking specifically at those solutions. While we have seen actions move forward on debt relief, which could, for the 73 poorest countries, amount to about $20 billion in relief, it's not enough to meet the demands or the demands of African finance ministers who've unilaterally called for $45 billion in debt relief. Because we don't have a bankruptcy process in place, we don't have emergency debt restructuring measures, and while there were conversations after the last financial crisis to be able to move forward these urgent solutions, they haven't moved forward. So today's discussion is about a very important concept that's on the table, a concept that has been utilized before, a concept that has been endorsed by the head of the International Monetary Fund, the UN General Secretary, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, many rich countries, many poor countries around the world. It's accessing the special drawing rights or emergency financial reserves. And we're going to talk about that discussion, that particular item today with this wonderful group of panelists that we have assembled. We're so excited to have with us today from Latindadd, Patricia Miranda, their Global Advocacy Director. We have Arauz, who is the former director of Ecuador's central bank. We have with us Jean Saldanha, the executive director of Eurodad, and Matthew Martin, the director of Debt Relief International and the advisor for many Francophone countries, OFI countries, in looking at these very specific and critical issues. We just learned that the Honorable Minister, Ken Ofori-Atta, will not be able to join us. He said he was called into a meeting with the President of Ghana that he must attend. So he sends his regrets to all of us today, but he says he will continue to be a strong advocate for moving forward the special drawing rights and these particular initiatives. Before we begin with our speakers, there are a few logistical issues. Again, we're very excited and we welcome the 350 people who registered today. We welcome the journalists who are with us, the members of parliaments and congresses from around the world, as well as civil society partners, IMF staff and United Nations staff who've arranged their schedules to join this important conversation. In terms of asking questions during this conversation today, you must use the Q&A function. We're very delighted to have Mark Pira and Yolanda Fresnio from Eurodad be able to take your questions if they are in Spanish or English. As you know, this is being simultaneously translated in Spanish on the Zoom function. But again, you must use the Q&A function to submit your questions. The chat function will be open for approximately a half an hour, and then it will be closed. The chat function's only purpose is if people are having technical issues or logistical issues in accessing the webinar. If you are having technical issues, if you are having a problem, please use the chat function, which will be closed within a half an hour. And then the only way to submit questions for our question and answer segment during this hour-and-a-half conversation will be through the Q&A function. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Patricia Miranda, who I have several questions for in terms of these particular issues. I'll ask a round of questions to each of our panelists, and then each of our panelists will be able to respond to that first round of questions that I ask. Patricia, you really have become a very important advocate for this issue. Coming from a middle-income country, the reality is that in all of Latin America and the Caribbean, there are only 2 countries that are categorized as low income. So the current debt relief initiatives that have moved forward don't benefit any countries really in the Caribbean or Latin America, but that's where we are looking from this financial crisis to see some of the highest jobless rates. From this current crisis, it's also where we're looking to see some of the most significant increases in extreme poverty. So I would like you to please outline for us, what are the main concerns from developing countries in the face of the pandemic? Not only low-income countries, but also middle-income countries. What are the main concerns that we need to understand as we begin this conversation today? And while debt relief is important, is it enough? And finally, if you could please address what are your motivations and the motivations of Eurodad, of Afrodad, of Latindadd and Jubilee USA network of civil society in taking on this vital issue of the special drawing rights. Patricia.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm very pleased to be in this panel with great speakers and experts. So, and thanks everyone, all participants for joining us today. We are facing a severe global recession. the major in almost a century. Almost all economies have shut down, except for the care economy, and we are already living the effects. COVID is having a more negative impact on global growth than initial projections, as you mentioned, and we saw yesterday with the World Economic Outlook release. It's the global growth, the new projection of global growth is minus 4.9% for 2020. The most vulnerable people don't have equal access to healthcare services. They are losing their jobs, or they are part of a huge informal sector that can't earn their livelihoods, where women are overrepresented. The dilemma that we unfortunately see every day for many people in our countries is to die from COVID or to die from hunger. Since the epicenter of the pandemic has shifted from Europe and North America to the global south, the death toll in low and middle income countries has increased. Under a downside scenario, the most recent World Bank estimations say that around 100 million people could be pushed into extreme poverty. While some developed countries are able to increase their government spending with unprecedented stimulus packages, most developing countries are struggling to have access to resources to fight this pandemic. This, of course, reflects a systemic flaw in the global economy, where the poor in developing countries are disproportionately affected. Before COVID, developing countries had already fiscal deficits. For example, almost all Latin American countries had fiscal deficits before COVID. Or other developing countries have scarce fiscal space options, and in addition, following the last decade trend, they have as well a large and fast increase of their debt levels. Under a new landscape of debt with a very complex context for launching a restructuring process with the current system. So advanced economies can borrow in their local currencies at low interest rates. They can use fiscal and monetary policies to finance COVID response, to provide help to people and to their local private sector. And they can take measures such as printing money by its central banks. These are very limited options for developing countries, which have less access to financial markets, therefore less access to rollover options to repay their current debt, and also have usually higher borrowing costs. Our countries need urgently resources to fight the pandemic under a very limited healthcare service to preserve life. And we need to reactivate the economy, our economies. Considering that recovery will take a longer period for us, and that other sources as domestic resource mobilization or increase of official development assistance seem not to be a feasible option with the urgency needed now. So among the solutions in place, there is the debt moratorium announced by the G20 on official bilateral debt owed by the poorest economies until for 2020, until December 2020. But our concern is that this temporary deferment won't be sufficient. It's just a postponement of the current fiscal problem. More ambitious measures are needed to be taken, as a permanent debt service cancellation for 2020 and also for 2021 for all developing countries. Moreover, when the recession is global and middle-income countries, among them lower middle-income countries, that are severely hit by the pandemic, are not part of these initiatives. So our concern is that the main option for developing countries to fight this crisis is the access to new loans, which is not really a solution because of the future debt burden that it would imply over an already high projected debt service for some countries for the future years. And especially because it would mean cuts to the investment in public services and the investment on social protection. under, as I mentioned, a new debt landscape and a debt distress risks. And in addition, some countries prefer to take loans despite risking their sustainability, instead of asking for debt relief to preserve their image to the international financial markets. These are the concerns that, that we have, that civil society organizations have, and we are motivated by all the middle and long-term impacts that these short-term solutions can have, which not only undermine the accomplishment of SDGs, but also threatens with going backwards on the few advances on development goals that countries have, where the leaving no one behind then becomes an empty and meaningless slogan. Under a short and long-term proposals that we as civil society organizations, along with our partners and the co-organizers of this webinar, we have different recommendations, and we have posed different challenges for several years towards a new international financial architecture. But today we want to put on the table and discuss this initiative, raised already by several voices, such as the United Nations Secretary General and United Nations agencies as UNCTAD, the African Finance Minister, the International Monetary Fund, and many countries and civil society organizations, which is an initiative to provide liquidity with non-refundable funding and no conditionalities that helps our countries now to face the crisis without more debt and especially prioritizing lives. Thank you very much. We cannot hear you, Eric.
Thank you. I think perhaps one of the most popular phrases of 2020 will be, you're on mute. Thank you, Patricia, for that particular overview. And it's important to acknowledge the desperation that many countries are facing and the few options that are on the table. Our next speaker is going to go into more depth on some of those particular options. I do want to remind people, if you're having technical issues, to use the chat function. That'll be open for the next 15 minutes. I want to especially thank Omar from Latindadd, who has been very quickly dealing with technical issues that people have. And I also want to thank people in the audience and participants for their special thank yous to Dee and Viviana, our wonderful interpreters today, for their very fine translation into Spanish that's happening simultaneously. As we go deeper into the issue, we're very lucky to have the former director of Ecuador's central bank. Ecuador is a country in particular that has really dealt with some of the most severe consequences of the pandemic so far, both in terms of the economic crisis, but also having insufficient means to dealing with what is a growing health crisis within Ecuador. Some of the challenges that we've also seen in Ecuador stem directly from the austerity policies and challenges with the IMF debt restructuring and IMF financing plans that the country has faced. This is why we have a very special perspective from Andres Arauz, and in particular, Andres is someone who has direct experience with the special drawing rights, or being able to access these crucial global reserves. So Andreas, in terms of some of the questions and some of the points that we're really hoping you're able to answer and lift with us today, is a breakdown. What exactly are special drawing rights? What are the SDRs? How do they work? Why should we use them now? Do they have the same operation as a loan? Is this just another type of loan that can get countries into more trouble? Or is it something different? Can the SDRs be used for budget support? How did it work in 2009, where you have direct experience when we last used the global reserves, the special drawing rights to deal with the global financial crisis? And finally, how many SDRs or special drawing rights should we generate? What should we do in terms of a donation? And how much of an allocation do we really need? So if you could please break these issues down for us, we're so grateful that you're here with us and taking this time today, Andres.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for the invitation to Latindadd. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Well, there are many issues around SDRs. I will try to be brief and try to be concise in terms of the elements that you have mentioned. So basically, SDRs are technically what's called an international reserve asset. The values of SDRs are defined by a weighted basket of some of the world's most important currencies, among them dollars, euros, pounds, yen, and Chinese yuan, renminbi. In practice, though, they are basically a global currency, but it is created by the votes of the states, of sovereigns, and basically they are issued out of thin air by a specialized unit at the IMF called the SDR department. In order to be created, SDRs require an 85% majority of voting power at the Board of Governors of the IMF, right? So in 2009, this is what happened, and SDRs were issued. Approximately 275 billion SDRs were issued, and sorry, $275 worth of SDRs were issued, and they were distributed to different countries in the world, basically in proportion to the size of their economies, which is the voting power represented at the IMF. As a recent policy brief by CEPR and Oxfam America mentions, SDRs can be used in this juncture to pay for imports that are critically necessary, such as medical equipment, medical technologies, and perhaps sooner rather than later, even for the vaccine. And but they can also be used to pay for debt service, especially for middle-income countries that have a restriction in terms of access to foreign exchange. This would definitely help them in order to decrease the debt burden for this year. Of course, we're also looking for debt relief in general, but this could be understood and has been understood in several dimensions as a way of debt relief, and I will explain why. The moment to issue these SDRs is now. As Patricia has mentioned, the IMF has predicted a severe downfall in the economies of developing countries, especially in Latin America right now. We are now the hotspot of the virus, with not only health consequences, but with serious economic consequences. And I think more foreign debt is definitely not the way. It will imply basically a lost decade or two, and especially not if they are conditionality-based loans. SDRs are not loans. They are not reimbursable. The principal is not reimbursable ever. Only very small interest rates, which I like to call them rather fees, have to be paid. Right now, the rate is 0.05 of 1%. So basically, any country can afford that. And that's why it's a very valuable alternative for developing countries now. In the case of Ecuador in 2009, on the same day that the SDRs were allocated, the central bank sent a swift message to the IMF SDR department to request the exchange of SDRs into dollars. The SDR department then brokers this exchange with other countries who have dollar surpluses and then makes the exchange possible. Now, as to your question regarding budget support, I think this is important. Once the SDRs are received by countries, by each country, it is a matter of domestic legislation and domestic policy how those SDRs are distributed internally. For example, in the case of the US, SDRs are not on the balance sheet of the Fed, of the central bank. They are on the balance sheet of the US Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund, right? So that means it doesn't necessarily have to be in the hands of the central bank. It can also go to Treasury. In the case of Ecuador, because the allocation was to the Republic of Ecuador, the central bank credited the SDR dollar equivalent to the Ministry of Finance's treasury account at the central bank. This was possible because, as in most legislations around the world, as is also the case in Ecuador, the central bank is allowed to transfer equity to the Ministry of Finance, just like it transfers earnings, or earnings at the end of every year, right? The net income of the central bank is transferred to the Ministries of Finance. And this was the legal framework that was used in 2009 to help the budget with this extraordinary income. Alternatively, though, an equivalent dollar amount could be lent by central banks to governments if the domestic legislation allows so. So the possibilities are there. It basically depends on the domestic framework set up in order to serve as budget support, not only for balance of payments reasons. Now, SDRs are pretty much a consensus now. You can find several resources on what SDRs are and who supports them or who has been supporting them in a website, globalcovidresponse.org. I think someone already posted this on the chat. But right now we need a very large issuance of SDRs, Eric. I've been proposing 3 trillion SDRs, and even though that number may sound large, sometimes we forget that the headline number is a little imprecise, because from a developing perspective, only about a third of the headline number will actually go to developing countries because of the rules of distribution of SDRs. So when we have that, basically rich countries have issued and spent over $10 trillion because of the COVID crisis, it is extremely reasonable, perfectly reasonable, to propose 1 trillion SDRs for developing countries. And this would be basically $1 trillion SDRs for 155 countries, unlike the large issuance of money that, as Patricia mentioned, that central banks have been printing and distributing in the richer countries of the planet. Now, importantly, the amount of SDRs to be issued not only depend on IMF statutes or IMF legislation, but also on domestic US legislation. The indispensable US vote is regulated by the SDR Act of 1968. It says that a much smaller issuance is available without congressional approval, but it is within this legal framework that lawmakers have proposed legislation in Congress, but we're now looking forward to a bipartisan support in the Senate with the White House to have this go forward. I think it's very important that the world understand that perhaps a donation of SDRs can perhaps also mean a certain distraction from what we really need, because a donation will imply a long and tedious process of domestic approvals and international adequacy of the norms to create the right mechanism for these donations to take place. And middle-income countries such as Ecuador and most of Latin America, which is facing a dire situation right now, basically do not have the time for all of this. We need a large allocation soon. And then once the large allocation happens, we can start to think about ways to donate, to redistribute, or to reallocate then existing SDRs. That's what I can contribute from my experience and my position as a Latin American economist. Thank you.
Andres, thank you so much for that explanation and breaking down both the need for the SDRs, how SDRs could work, and the recommendation for at least a $3 trillion issuance of special drawing rights to not only deal with the current economic crisis, to not only deal with the current health crisis, but also to ensure that countries can emerge with some resilience from this crisis. Our next speaker, who we're very excited to have, is Matthew Martin, who's an advisor of Francophone countries in Africa and the Director of Development Finance International. Before I ask several questions to Matthew, our logistics team has asked for a few reminders. Obar, who's coordinating logistics, has asked all speakers if they can to speak louder. We've turned up the volume as high as we can. We understand that there are some people who've had a challenge with hearing. So panelists, feel free to shout. I think that could help. Also, to remind folks that the chat function is only to deal with problems with translation, with technical issues. If you're having any issues, and in just a few minutes, the chat function will be disabled. When we begin the question and answer function shortly, that question and answer function will be using the Q&A box that you all have access to. We'd ask that you use the Q&A box to ask your questions so that our team, Mark and Yolanda, are able to sort the questions and group them, as we already have many questions that are coming in quickly on the Q&A function. So Matthew Martin, if we can turn it over to you to take us a little bit more deeper into some of the SDR issues, some of the technicalities that you're looking at, and that could be helpful in understanding some of these more technical aspects of the SDRs. The SDR allocation is according to quota membership at the IMF. Please also let us know, what does that mean? What is quota membership at the IMF? And what would be your analysis on a reallocation on the size of the issuance? How much should that reallocation be? Is this particular operation, does it just give more power to the IMF over countries? Does it give the IMF control over countries? Or does it do something different? And do you see any other ways for countries to have resources with the urgency of the economic crisis and the pandemic? Matthew, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Eric. First of all, let me begin by saying I'm very conscious I'm not nearly as smart as you, but it is the hottest June day ever in the UK at 34 degrees centigrade, and we're not used to hot days in the UK, so there's no air conditioning. So apologies for the fact that actually I won't stand up and show you, but I am wearing shorts during this presentation. I want to start by saying that what I'm going to say is based on a lot of work we've been doing with a lot of countries across the world. That includes Commonwealth countries, and it includes, as Eric mentioned at the beginning, the members of OIF, the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. We started this work among 30 low-income countries, low and lower middle-income countries, who looked at the issue of SDRs as a response to COVID and were very keen on it. And that includes Ghana, because bizarrely Ghana is a member of La Francophonie, even though French is not widely spoken there, but it is spoken by some people. And then we took this as a proposal and a suggestion to broader African finance ministers and to all the 88 member countries of La Francophonie, the largest of which are France and Canada. And everybody was very supportive of it. So I want to explain why that's the case by looking at the point of an SDR allocation and the alternatives. And then I'll come back to the kind of how, if you like, the scale and the allocation and the reallocation and so on. So when I was studying 30 years ago now at LSE, I learned about SDRs, and they were a wonderful thing dreamt up by people who were real internationalists in 1947, when Bretton Woods was all being put together, to have some system of having automatic global liquidity to fight precisely the types of crises that we're facing now. People didn't think in those days of global pandemics, but they thought of wars, they thought of economic shocks that could come along. And when the IMF started life, these were a very high percentage of the amount that was available from SDRs was a very high percentage of global GDP and trade. Over time, it's been kind of run down as the need for this type of liquidity has been perceived as less important, because we have had, in some people's minds, fewer crises. I'm not sure that's true, but nevertheless, and therefore they now represent a very small percentage of global trade and GDP. The idea was that they should be given automatically to countries on the grounds that they'd been hit by an external shock, which was not their fault, and that seems to me absolutely the circumstances we're in with COVID. that they should have, as was said by the previous speaker, pretty much no cost, so very little fee for cashing them in, and no conditionality, except obvious thing like being a member of the IMF. So if you're from Cuba or North Korea, you wouldn't get any SDRs because they're not members of the IMF. So that is what they were supposed to be doing. And unfortunately, over the years, they haven't always been used for that purpose. But every time the world has recognized that we have a crisis, we've come back to them. So in the 1970s, when the crisis was inflation and countries' economies were collapsing, we came back to them, and there were several issuances of SDRs. In 1990, we didn't do much in the 1990s about the Asian crisis, but when we got around to the global financial crisis in 2009, again, there was a very rapid issue of SDRs, precisely to provide this type of unconditional, low-cost finance. And particularly useful it's been for low-income countries over the years who don't just have a balance of payments problem, but have a budget hole, which is absolutely the case now. We've been working recently with Somalia to get its debt relief finally under the HIPC process. And while we were doing that, the Minister of Finance was going down to the port of Mogadishu to close it because as a result of COVID, no ships were showing up in the port, which basically meant that pretty much all the budget revenue for Somalia was disappearing. And so even countries like Somalia, which you would think of as perhaps least connected to the global economy and to the pandemic, are suffering massive falls in their budget revenue. So the really vital thing for poorer countries is that this money can be passed through into the budget and spent, as it was in 2009. If you think about alternatives, I think it's particularly vital, as Patty hinted at the beginning, for middle-income countries. Why? First of all, because as things are currently designed, they have less prospect than lower-income countries do of getting debt relief. I hope we'll manage to change that in the next 6 months or so. But also the alternative sources of lending they have are much more expensive, whether they go to the markets or to multilateral development banks or the IMF, than those available from official channels for low-income countries. So as Patty put it, essentially, those countries, if we don't have some source of funding like SDRs, are faced with either expensive debt or austerity or a combination of the two in order to get their economies back on track. And, you know, some people have suggested other solutions like global wealth taxes, and I'm totally in favor of those, but they'll take a long time to introduce and a long time for the money to get to the poorer countries. So that's really why we need them. And I think it's important to remember that that was precisely what they were created for, that they're there to be an automatic, rapid source of liquidity. I was very interested to hear the experience from Ecuador of how quickly they actually came. And that's certainly why the countries are very anxious to have them. At the moment, in the absence of SDRs, they're being forced to use other sources of funding from the IMF. So even compared with other sources of funding from the IMF, they're a lot better. So they're being forced to use either the rapid low conditionality financing facilities that exist in the IMF. 75 countries currently using those, but they do have some conditionality. And then 35 countries are now in a situation where they've had to go to the high conditionality funding from the IMF because the rapid financing has not been enough, and that's very intrusive conditionality on countries. So if your concern is about having lots of conditionality on countries, then SDRs are a much better option than the other ones. So finally, let me then look a bit at the scale. So I mean, I think I would go even further than my predecessor did. Why? Because the global economic crisis has got worse. When we were talking about, and I contributed to the various Oxfam briefing papers and other briefing papers, the Untitled briefing paper on this back in April, and people were talking around somewhere between 1 and 3 trillion, the scale expected of the global GDP fall then was only about 5 to 6%. So it was expected that in 2020, global GDP would grow by about 5%, and in April, it was expected to fall by about 1%. It's now expected to fall by more than 5%. So the total fall compared to where we should have been this year is about 10%. I won't bore you with the details of all of the calculations, but if you look at what we would need to put in as stimulus to counteract that type of a GDP fall, you would be talking in the region of 5 trillion, which would also be, interestingly, about a half of what OECD countries have themselves spent on stimulus. And that's very interesting because essentially as my predecessor pointed out, the OECD countries are about 60% of global GDP and developing countries are about 40%. So that's about the balanced allocation as well. So I would say, given the growing scale of the problem, particularly if we end up with a second wave, which in some cases it looks like we may do, or a continuing first wave, as I've seen it described in other places, and particularly as I think we don't know the scale of the impact fully in developing countries yet, because as Patty pointed out, the pandemic is now just beginning to grow really fast on them. We've seen a lot of economic damage, but we could see even more in the future. Then we definitely will need to go, I think, above the 3 trillion figure. The issue of whether we need to allocate, reallocate, whatever. So as Eric asked me to say, what are quotas? So when you join the IMF, you get allocated a quota, which means essentially determines your voting share within the IMF as well. And that's based on the share that you have in global GDP and global trade. It's quite a complicated formula. But what it means is that developing countries get less, and developing countries have only about 1/3 of the quotas in the IMF at the moment. There have been discussions ongoing for many years about increasing that share, and that should definitely be done. But what it means is that if we issue a lot of SDRs, the developing countries would only get about 35% of them. If we issue them with the revised quotas, it would be a bit higher. And therefore, if you want most of the money to go to developing countries, you need to have a process of reallocation, or as my predecessor was calling it, donation. Personally, I think it might be easier to just issue a great deal more. When I said at the beginning of this that the countries of the OECD had issued 10 trillion, well, yes, they have. And I think some of us are rejoicing that part of that issuance has involved abandoning the, I think, rather unjustifiable ideology that says you must bring down your debt burdens to virtually, or to as low as you possibly can, and you must not have budget deficits. So countries which have held that as a real tenet of their economic policy, like Germany, Canada, Australia, have all been saying, no, in this type of a crisis, we need to do something different. But I can see that they might well go back in the other direction, as some of them did after the 2009-10 global financial crisis. And if that's the case, they might want to use some SDRs also to pay down some of their debt. So I think we need to work out exactly what that situation will be, whether OECD countries do need to some of that, those SDRs spent on them as well. But even if they don't, let me just give you an idea of the scale. If, for example, we just issue SDRs, 1 trillion of SDRs now, Ethiopia would, for example, get enough to increase its health budget by 50%. Which sounds good, but when you think of all the things that Ethiopia is faced with and the needs for social protection and economic stimulus, that's nowhere near enough. If we reallocate those SDRs or donate them and donate the existing SDRs, Ethiopia could basically double its health and social protection spending. So it would make a big difference. And obviously, if we issue more, then there's even more money there to help countries confront the problems. So that would be the scale that I was talking about. Finally, let me end by just saying a word about urgency. This is really urgent now. And I think it's more urgent than anything else that we could possibly do. The debt relief, the debt suspension, the debt service suspension, which has happened, is good as far as it goes. There are problems with it, but at least it's come in immediately for the creditors who are participating. The bigger debt cancellation process, which I know we all feel very strongly about, is likely to take months. I think it's unlikely to come through for most countries before the end of the year, if not next year. So if we want to do something really to help countries right now, particularly countries, middle-income countries, and notably in Latin America and Asia, we need to do it now. By now, it would be nice to see a decision at the G20 finance ministers meeting coming up shortly. But at the very latest by the annual meetings. As my colleague from Ecuador said, it can be disbursed very quickly once that's done, but countries really need this right now. I think of a country like Somalia. Imagine trying to fight a pandemic with no budget revenue at all, and think of where that leaves you. So we really need that money as soon as humanly possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And thank you very much for highlighting the urgency, but also the reality that now in this particular immediate moment, really an SDR issuance is really the only option we have. in terms of critically being able to move forward, not only responses to the health and economic crisis caused by COVID, but also the reality that where the United States and much of Europe has been able to pass stimulus plans or bridge financing plans in order to bolster social protections, increase healthcare spending, as well as keep people with incomes in the north. Without an SDR issuance, there are really no options for people in the South and the developing world to pass any kind of needed stimulus or bridge financing programs that those countries desperately need in the immediate term to deal with the health and economic crisis, as well as for their populations to survive and for famine in much of the world where extreme poverty is to be eliminated. Our last speaker today, before we move into our question and answer period, and again, please keep the questions coming through the Q&A function. Those are being taken right now and culminated and prepared by Yolanda and Mark that I'll be asking the panelists shortly. But before we get into that period, our last speaker is Jean Saldanha. Jean is the executive director of Eurodad, our counterpart in Europe from Jubilee, USA, and have also been working on the front lines to move forward this issuance with the G20 and the IMF. Jean, as you're the last speaker on today's panel, I would like you perhaps first just to give us some of your reactions, to do a recap, offer the highlights. What are the big takeaways that the panelists have offered so far today? What are the highlights of this conversation that we need to keep in front of us? And then how do you feel we can all work together to take these efforts forward? And finally, I guess, why do you think the SDRs are important for the longer term policies that need to be addressed post-COVID? So not only now, the immediacy, the urgency, but also what are some of the longer term policies that an SDR issuance is going to be able to help us so that our entire global community can emerge with more resilience? Jean.
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me say that it is really an important opportunity to discuss this very timely issue. We, Eurodad, together with the organizations and movements that are part of the network of debt and development organizations worldwide, have been working very hard since the onset of this crisis to really put this issue on the agenda. So we welcome very much this conversation we're having this today, and hope that we can pull together our collective efforts to ensure that we can advance on this very important and very urgent discussion. First of all, let me say that I found the inputs really complimentary and very, very stimulating this today. First of all, let me just remind us what Patricia said, that indeed, while in Europe, we are seeing a decline in mortalities and decrease of infection across the world, and particularly in Latin America and very populous countries, we are seeing a steep surge in mortalities. So this crisis is very real. The health crisis is very real, and the economic crisis is here to stay. And as Patricia said, while economies have been put on pause, the care economy continues to work. The care economy is essentially an unpaid economy, and it is essentially an economy which women are disproportionately responsible for. So I'd like to first of all zero in on the point that essentially this crisis is a very gendered crisis we are facing. 740 million women who work in the informal sector have been strongly hit by the lockdown. The majority of workers in the public health sector are women. So essentially, turning a blind eye to the impacts of this crisis is turning a blind eye to the majority of the women and girls of this world. And that is unconscionable and something that needs to be addressed. I also wanted to underline the fact that all our speakers mentioned that while we see unprecedented stimulus packages in a number of countries, a lot of countries have forgotten that they ever were concerned about debt. Essentially, that is not an option for many middle-income countries and many low middle-income countries. That access to borrowing in local currencies is not an option. There is a chance, and it is happening, that we are going to see a regression in the achievement and advancement of the SDG agenda. And here and now, 10 years to the SDG deadline, it doesn't seem like we will ever achieve the SDGs, which is certainly a huge concern, considering the emergency of a number of the issues that the Agenda 2030 had tabled 5 years ago. I also would very quickly underline the points that were raised by all the speakers, that we believe that the SDRs are not only an important emergency measure. Of course, there are alternatives, but indeed they will take a longer time to put in place. The SDGs, the SDRs were a mechanism that were meant to provide emergency financing. They are there. Essentially, they are without conditions, and they are much more desirable than new lending, which is much more expensive. I think the key issue over here is, the key issue over here is political will for a new issuance, and political will also for reallocation. As Matthew has mentioned, the scope of the need is so considerable that we are looking at the need for an issuance, a new issuance of 3 trillion plus SDRs, as well as, if possible, a reallocation. And then very quickly to respond to your other points, I would say, first of all, if we go back to the origin of the SDR agenda, let me just remind you that in the late 1960s, UNCTAD had advocated for the establishment of a development link as part of the issuance process. The idea was for the allocation of SDRs to diverge from the established IMF quotas, which would allow developing countries to obtain a greater proportion of a given issuance, which would have allowed the LDCs a much more generous allocation. Unfortunately, that did not happen, but I think that is worth a consideration at this point of time, where we are saying that we need to build back better. What is the meaning of build back better? How can we put this discussion back on the table? I also want to remind us of what was put on the table by UNCTAD's latest Trade and Development Report in 2019, where it called for an SDR-based global fund to leverage environmental reserve assets for environmental protection to tackle the impacts of climate change related shocks on debt sustainability in developing countries. And also there have been more and more calls for allocating SDRs for SDG related lending. So I think there are a number of options that we have on the table. I don't think this is a new discussion. I think it is a discussion that is seriously worth revisiting at this point of time, considering the emergency of the current situation, where we need an urgent new issuance, but looking to the future, considering, are we using the potential of SDRs to its maximum to really provide the financing at a low cost, as well as without conditionality that is needed right now by low and middle income countries to respond to the current challenges that we face, not only in tiding over the crisis, but also being able to respond to longer term challenges around sustainable development and climate change. I will leave it at that because I know there are a number of questions.
Great. Jean, thank you so much. And again, thank you to all of our wonderful panelists today. We really appreciate that you've all been succinct and so pointed in your remarks. That allows us more than a half an hour for question and answers today, which again is really extraordinary because we already have, I believe, more questions than we're going to probably be able to totally answer. But we're going to do our best. Please keep them coming in. And again, thank you to Mark and Yolanda for grouping the first group of questions. What I'd like to do is offer this first grouping of questions. A lot of them for the first grouping is on some of the more technical issues. And I would like speakers to respond, but really encourage you to keep your responses tight to a minute and a half to 2 minutes so we can at least get through 2 more rounds of questions. And if you hear someone else answer the question more succinctly, please feel free to pass and then we'll have you go first in the next round of questions. So some of the questions that have come in so far, again, are around some of the technical issues of SDRs. So to our panel today, what are the terms of SDR interest? Are these like loans? How does interest work? When is there interest? When is there not interest? Is this just like a loan? Is this going to add more debt burden because it's another type of loan? Another question that has come in is that could this impact the value of the dollar or other currencies? If this is issued, could this mean that countries that rely on the value of their currency, like Europe, China, the United States, is there a downside for them on this or not? What are the other obstacles in place? Is there a limit to the amount of SDRs that can be donated? Is there a limit to the amount that can be created? Don't we just have 648 billion? Is that all we have? Why are people talking about trillions here? And what are the other obstacles in terms of how this process can work? Can it be used for other debt relief like the CCRT? So that was a grouping of a number of technical questions, and I'll try to put them back to the group as needed. But perhaps I could invite Andreas to go first for 2 minutes, and then Jean, Patricia, and Matthew. Andreas.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you for the questions as well. So yeah, these are a bit technical, and that we will have to get into a little bit of detail, not too much, but here we go. So when an average country receives SDRs from a creation and an allocation of SDRs, they don't have to pay interest for just having those SDRs. Interest is paid only if that country decides to exchange SDRs for what you may call hard currency, one of the 5 that were mentioned earlier, right? So once those SDRs are exchanged, now, of course, you have, say, dollars instead of SDRs. So you pay on the net deficit position of SDRs that you have. So if you exchanged 1 million SDRs for $1.4 million, you will pay the interest rate for those 1 million SDRs. And what the rate is calculated based on a weighted average of basically the risk-free rate of those 5 currencies. And right now that rate is at 0.05 of 1%. So it's a very, very tiny rate. It has to be paid indefinitely and until you re-exchange until you exchange the SDRs back. You deliver the dollars and get the SDRs back. Now the country that gave you those dollars will earn interest on those dollars and will have SDRs as a surplus. So that's how the mechanism works. that's also the incentive for those countries that are on the surplus side of the equation to actually give the dollars to the countries that are in need of them. And that's how the mechanism is working right now. Of course, right now, the interest rates around the world are very low. That's why the fee is also very low. But it's predicted that, you know, for a very long time, perhaps a decade or two, those rates will be very, very low. Now, in terms of how this impacts the value of rich countries' currency, a large issuance will not have a direct impact on the values of those currencies. Why? Because SDRs are not tradable on the free market, right? This is a currency, this is a unit of account that's only traded or only exchanged among central banks. So the circulation is limited and it's not subject to speculation. What will impact the exchange rate of the richer countries' currencies will depend more on the market dynamics and on the large flows of currency and capital between the pairs of the rich countries' currencies. So the SDRs will not impact that directly. Please remember also that the valuation of SDRs is not a sort of open market valuation that depends on the moods of Wall Street one day or another. It's defined as a weighted average of global currency. So that's how the impact is defined. And just to be very brief on the limit to creation, we're talking about creation of SDRs. Okay, if issuance is a term that's not widely understood, we're talking about creating new SDRs. This creation is out of thin air. It's decided by a vote. It's an international money that's created in such a way, and then is distributed around to countries based on their voting power. I specifically do not favor the policy or the issue of a donation of SDRs, even the existing SDRs, because it will take a long time to get that in motion. So first, let's create more money for poor countries of the world, and then let's see if some of the countries that have a surplus of SDRs will want to donate that to the poorer countries of the planet.
Thank you, Andreas. And I think, Andreas, since you were able to give an overview of most of the questions, I'd like to target some different questions that have come up on debt to Jean, Patricia, and Matthew. But again, thank you for those takeaways that the SDRs are not alone. If SDRs are used exactly in its own currency, there's no interest rate at all. If there's a conversion that takes place by the central bank, then it's a 0.1% interest rate that countries are looking at. And again, it's not in the form of a particular loan. Also, very important reminder that we're talking about a new creation beyond the $648 billion. We're talking about the creation of trillions through an international vote, and most of those votes are needed from the US government, the G20, in order to move the process forward with the International Monetary Fund. Many related questions have come in around debt. So I would like to ask one of those targeted questions each to Jean and Patricia and Matthew, who are all noted international experts on debt issues. First, to Jean, on debt cancellation, is there a possibility of full or partial debt cancellation in the works? What does that mean? Multilateral, bilateral? And then to Patricia, how much of a willingness is there on the part of private creditors to participate in comprehensive debt relief? Are there barriers? How do we overcome this? And finally, to Matthew, is there any ability to create a sovereign debt resolution mechanism, the SDR, ebb that is being looked at, or was looked at in the early 2000s by the International Monetary Fund, but more recently what Unctad, what more than half of the G20 has advocated for, what civil society organizations have been advocating for, but a global bankruptcy process or global debt restructuring process that was last considered after the last financial crisis. So that last question to Matthew. So Jean, first, if you would want to respond to the question on what level of debt cancellation might be in the works, multilateral, bilateral, what do we need?
Yeah, happy to answer that question. A very important question indeed. And thanks to a lot of effort, the campaigning of a lot of organizations that we, the DADS networks, Latindadd, Afrodad, APMDD, Jubilee USA, Eurodad, pulled together to respond to what we saw as this huge debt wave coming to us in April, targeted at the G20. We did see some movement, and I think that is something to acknowledge, that there has been some movement in the offer that has been provided to create a debt moratorium, and it's essentially a suspension of debt servicing, but it is essentially not more than providing a very small dose of air for those countries that are drowning in debt right now, to have a little bit of oxygen to come up before being engulfed by another wave of debt servicing that will come up in 2021. Essentially, it is a very short window. We are hoping that there are discussions to extend that debt window, to extend the debt moratorium. But again, we believe that a debt moratorium, what is on the table right now, is insufficient in that it does not cover enough of countries. Not enough of countries have come forward to take advantage of it. It does not sufficiently cover the number of countries that we currently see in incredible levels of debt distress, and are continuing to divert preciously needed public money from investments in the public and the health sector in particular at this point of time, to service their debts. So essentially what we have on the table right now is far from debt cancellation. We only have a temporary moratorium. We are working towards the G20 finance ministers meeting coming up in July, as well as the annual meetings in the G20 that is coming up later this year, to call for a broader cancellation of multilateral debt. Now that's another issue. It is just multilateral debt that the G20 has been negotiating on. A huge elephant in the room is private creditors, because so far they have been holding out. They have not agreed to become part of any package or on a debt moratorium, no on debt cancellation. There are discussions right now. There is no mechanism in place to address private creditor debt. This is an urgent issue that needs to be addressed without them free riding on other debt packages that are offered to countries, and essentially preying on countries who are already buckling under the pressure of their current debt levels. I'd say that essentially we are right in the middle of the fight. We shouldn't give up the fight right now on the G20 and on extension of the debt moratorium, and calling for a debt cancellation, no matter how impossible it looks, but importantly also addressing the issue of private creditor debt.
Jean, thank you very much. And Patricia, if you want to maybe take us a little bit deeper into the private creditor debt, and also perhaps offer your opinion of the level of debt cancellation that's needed. In particular, right now, even the minimal debt relief efforts, which we've won, which have been important, as Jean noted, do not extend to middle income countries. So what are debt relief measures and cancellation measures that are needed for middle income countries as well? And deeper, more into some of the challenges with the private sector. Why isn't the private sector participating yet, even though the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the G20 have urged them to? Patricia.
Thank you, Eric. And well, I would just make some additional remarks to what Jean has already accurately mentioned. And it's a very challenging question because private creditors have become very important in many debt portfolios for borrowing countries. The last decade, the issuance of sovereign bonds has been a very important source of funds for many developing countries, and in most cases, the most expensive source of funds, especially for middle income countries. Now, the problem is that it's very hard and complex to know who they are, who do we deal with, who are the owners of these sovereign bonds. And indeed, there should be this information available for countries, for borrowing countries, to start dealing with this, with a process on this debt. And it's very low ambitious that private sector has been asked to join the debt relief initiative on a volunteer basis. And so far, what we see from the Institute of International Finance and their principles and their are basically to prioritize private creditors' interests with formulas and calculations that basically will not allow them to lose any money and just to make a deferment of the debt service. And from our view, not only private creditors, but all creditors need to do an effort to help developing countries to fight this crisis, and especially countries that are very close to a debt distress or are already in default. And I would like to link this with with the other question you made, which is about the debt relief. And I would like to make an emphasis here that what we are asking is not the same initiative as we had in the past, as the HIPIC debt relief initiatives, which was mainly based on stock. What we are asking is a permanent debt cancellation for the debt service of this year and the next one, which in terms of liquidity might have differences, and it's not the same. So that's the demand we have. And of course, from the analysis we do in Latin America, our countries as well, most of the middle income countries is basically Haiti, the lower income country in our region. And our countries are not part of any of these initiatives. We have projected for the next years, in some countries in Latin America have high debt service ratios projected, very scarce fiscal space, or in most cases a fiscal deficit that our countries have for the last 2 years at least. So with really no guarantee to have the fiscal incomes in the future to pay this deferred debt or to pay the current projections of debt service. So that is a huge risk, because again, our countries will have to choose between paying a high debt service for debts that right now would contribute to face the pandemic, and between paying that or cutting investment on social protection, cutting investment on healthcare services. So that's why, in our view, it's getting more debt is not a solution. And just speaking a little bit of what our other panelists were mentioning regarding the SDR issuance, it should not be in the form of a new debt, and also not a debt relief. We think that debt relief should be part of the creditors' contribution to this crisis and towards closing inequality gaps as well, and not also in terms of a donation, but it's not an ODA, it's a transfer of resources created, as Andres explained before. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And finally, Matthew Martin, are you still with us?
I am.
Great. And so this last question is directed to you, specifically around what is the need for some type of global bankruptcy process, debt restructuring process. And since we last looked at the process as a global community in 2008, 2009, where is the conversation at now, and where does it need to go?
Yeah, so I think just before I get on to that, just a couple of quick things. One is that at the moment, I mean, I agree exactly with what was said about in answer to the three first sets of questions. The actual interest rate on SDRs at the moment, or the fee charge as it's called, is 0.08%, which means that for every $1 million that a country gets in SDR allocations, that charge would be $800. So it's pretty tiny, and as was said, it doesn't have to be repaid. I think a lot of us have been asking for some kind of international bankruptcy procedure for a very long time. The SDRM was an IMF attempt to get somewhere near that, perhaps not in the most ideal way, but it didn't get there. I don't frankly think that it's likely that we will get an international bankruptcy procedure brought in. But I think what's more likely and certainly doable by the end of this year is that we should get to the stage where there is a comprehensive debt relief mechanism, where the level of debt relief is based on what countries need to finance the SDGs in a sustainable way going forward, where debt relief is delivered much more rapidly so countries don't have to sit in arrears for months and years, cutting their expenditure on very important things to try to stop the arrears from accumulating more, and where the debt relief is more comprehensive so that every creditor participates. That's particularly important for middle-income countries, as Patty was saying, because they don't necessarily have other sources of funding, but also because there seems to have been this view that we can only have comprehensive debt relief, things like HIPC and MDRI, for low-income countries. What this pandemic is proving is that middle-income countries are just as vulnerable to the types of shocks we're seeing, and we need something set up essentially for all developing countries to be there. And then finally, to say about private creditors, I mean, I do think a lot of rubbish is talked about how difficult it is to get private sector creditors involved. There have been, I won't bore you with the history, but there have been hundreds of bond restructurings for developed and developing countries ever since bonds were invented, and creditors have ultimately participated. I think there is a fear in bond markets and among credit rating agencies and some other people that having some kind of comprehensive bond debt relief scheme, which applies to a lot of countries and is more automatic rather than case by case, might destabilize those markets or push up premiums or make it more difficult to work out what to do with their investments. But I just want to emphasize that all the evidence from all of those bond restructurings, and indeed from all debt restructurings globally, has been that if what you want is long-term stability of the bond markets, if what you want is better creditworthiness and therefore lower costs for the debtors, but more guaranteed stable returns for the investors, then what you want to get there is comprehensive debt relief, which puts the countries in a sustainable position to repay their debt. That's all, you know, every single study that's been done seriously shows that. And I think there just needs to be a great deal bigger effort by official creditors and international organizations to convince those private creditors that that is the case and show them how it's worked in a lot of countries. I was with the Bolivian government when we started, as their advisor, when we started negotiating their HIPC debt relief. Patty will remember some of this as well. And the private sector in Bolivia was very skeptical that debt relief was a good idea. or at least the central bank governor thought they might be because he'd been being told that. So we organized a meeting of all of the private sector creditors in Bolivia, and they said pretty much unanimously to the government, of course, if you stop having to, you know, grab money from everywhere to desperately stop accumulating arrears to us as your suppliers, as government, and as your investors in your bonds, then we will be a great deal happier when you have a sustainable debt picture. And that was the basis on which Bolivia went for HIPIC debt relief. And we really need to get back to that stage of saying very clearly, there is no reason why countries should have their credit ratings downgraded. In fact, if anything, they should be upgraded when they get comprehensive debt relief. And there's no reason why bond markets should be worried about this. And we need to, if there are some, there will doubtless be some holdout creditors, what we used to call vulture funds or vulture creditors in the past. But we need to put in place some strong legal provisions to stop them from undermining these agreements. And then I don't think there should be any problem about private creditors participating at all.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Now we have a few more questions. Thanks again to Mark and Yolanda for their heroic efforts in terms of coordinating these questions today for us. We do need to move into a closing. We are finishing in about 10 minutes. And so what I'd like to do is put some of these questions to the group, but also offer each of the panelists about 2 minutes just to offer any closing remarks. Then I will close by offering some next steps and also some responses to advocacy that some questions have come in on, and take us from there in terms of how we move forward together. So in terms of remaining questions that have come in, there are some technical questions. I would like to put this question to Andreas to incorporate with your closing remarks. But there seems to be some questions about whether central banks with surplus of SDRs can quote unquote donate these or lend them. There still are some issues around how central banks use them. Are they loaning them? If you can just I know you've offered responses to some people with those, but if you could just give us a little bit more of a concise reaction to that in your closing remarks. To Matthew, in your closing remarks, if you could also incorporate the response to a question about could there be some type of bill exchange that is done in Europe where we can move towards a zero hunger SDG program and create $1 trillion through doing a Euros futures instrument and bill exchange. Patricia, to incorporate in your closing remarks, a question that has arisen, you know, what is the critique or expansions of SDRs in terms of hurting the capital of developing countries? Wouldn't it be better just to have a coordinated default for developing countries? Wouldn't it be better just to have some type of southern alternative instead of what we're talking about here? And finally, Jean, if in your closing reaction, you're able to talk about what are the issues and challenges with dealing with any instrument, whether it's debt relief or SDRs, with countries with corrupt politicians or countries with inadequate governments like Haiti. So again, we do want to finish in about 10 minutes, so I'd ask each speaker to take about 2 minutes, and then I'll do a brief closing. Let us first turn it over to Patricia.
Thank you, Eric. And well, I will start with the question you made. And well, if we can choose between advocating for a debt service cancellation and a default, which the result could be the same for this and the next year, but it's important to have a global response to this crisis, and at least for Latin America, which it would be very difficult to have an integration from all our countries and all our governments to to jointly together assume a default. And I think this is a challenge as well for other southern regions. On the other hand, a default does not necessarily mean new income. A default or a debt service cancellation, it means to free some resources, but it's not enough in our view. So that's why we need, and our countries need, a liquidity. They need new, fresh resources to fight this pandemic. Within a period that has been already projected, the recovery for middle-income countries or for developing countries will be a larger period if we compare it with developed countries. So besides this, besides stop paying the debt service, our countries need new, fresh resources to have liquidity. And my last remarks would be that I think we have the enough experience with past crises, and we cannot solve a crisis with more debt. This is a crisis with no precedents. So we as civil society organizations demand policies with no precedents as well. Ambitious policies, because this is a multiple crisis, and COVID just accelerated other crises as a future debt crisis for some countries. And finally, I would like to make a call to different stakeholders, and not just civil society organizations, but also other stakeholders as parliamentarians, as journalists, as women's group, as youth, and different stakeholders to get more involved with this initiative. It would really be key and important to have resources now to fight the pandemic. I live in a lower middle income country, and we know what our countries are going through, and it's getting worse. It's not getting any better at all. So that will be my final remarks and requests and calls for different stakeholders. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Patricia. Andres, if you could respond to the central bank issue and offer any closing thoughts.
Yes, during my remarks earlier, I mentioned two different concepts of when the central bank is involved in transferring SDRs. So internationally, it is much more difficult for a central bank to donate SDRs to a developing country or a poor country or somebody else. It's fairly complicated because central banks usually have hard laws that do not allow them to just donate their resources. Imagine if somebody proposed they have central banks donate their gold, that's pretty hard for that to happen. And it's likewise for SDRs. Now, that's one context. Another thing is SDRs can be used by central banks and by national governments as part of their quotas for the IMF. So they can give their SDRs to the IMF as part of their mandatory commitments to the IMF when there are quota increases, for example. Now that's a different use for the SDRs, but remember that's not in itself a donation, because in exchange for that they get a larger share of their participation at the IMF. That's a different use that can happen, but neither of them are donations. Now the third context is when central banks can transfer the corresponding equity of the new SDRs that were allocated to their domestic national governments, to their treasury accounts. That's what we did in Ecuador in 2009, and that's what can happen in other frameworks, including the US framework, where in the case of the US, the SDRs are not allocated to the Federal Reserve, but to the US Treasury. So that can happen. It depends on the domestic legislation. And that's where I was saying that they could be used as a budget support. So we should be able to differentiate both cases. Now, as my final remarks, I would like to emphasize on three issues: the size, the urgency, and the perspective of middle-income countries. Now, for the size, I think it's very, very clear now, especially with what Matthew added, that, and with Patricia mentioned, we need new, fresh resources, right? The situation is getting more complex, not any simpler. And we need a large amount of money, considering the unequal distribution that SDRs have around the world, which has been recognized by everybody. That just means that we need a larger issuance if we want to do things appropriately and quickly. So size is very important in this case, and I think that has to be something that all stakeholders have to take into account when proposing this, and thus size then has a different instrumentality. It requires different legal and procedural steps. So I think that size is an element there. Now, urgency. Also, as Patricia mentioned, in Latin America, the situation is not getting any better. And I predict that it will not get any better in other parts of the world as well, with difficulties in terms of the economic systems, the large informal sectors, and the lack of resources in their health systems. So the urgency of having this money be distributed around is very important. We cannot say, oh, let's negotiate and, you know, let's have a plan in 2 or 3 years. We need this done as soon as possible within weeks. And the perspective of middle-income countries is very important. While there are initiatives that are definitely worth recognizing in terms of their intention, such as the donation of SDRs or other kinds of support, what we need are fresh resources, and especially for middle-income countries. Now I'm from my perspective of Latin America. In Latin America, only one country, like Patricia mentioned, would qualify under these special arrangements of this the relief efforts that are ongoing, while the rest of the region, which has more deaths, more cases, and so on, and with definitely inconvenient slopes, we need fresh resources, and we need that in the middle-income countries. The only possibility that's out there is SDRs right now. So those would be my final remarks. Thanks.
Thank you. And Matthew, can we turn to you for a brief response and closing thoughts? Matthew, you're on mute.
I'm off now, yeah. So I note that, you know, there were several proposals made in the comments for alternative ways in which we could achieve large amounts of money getting to countries quickly, including the bill issue. But look, SDRs are there already. Everybody's agreed that they are a good idea. The last time they were issued before the global financial crisis, the US was the biggest user of them to pay down its debt and sort things out in the middle of the oil crisis. In 2009-10, everybody agreed that we should do them, and we did them. There have been attempts to set up regional equivalents among developing countries. So there's the Chiang Mai initiative in Asia, there's the Fondo Latinoamericano de Reservas, FLAR, in Latin America, but they're very small and they don't reach these amounts at all. They don't really provide the amount of liquidity that's needed in the face of what is the biggest. Yesterday, the IMF was pointing out this is by far the biggest global crisis we've had since the Great Depression. They don't even know at the moment whether eventually the impact on economies might be bigger than the Great Depression if we have a second wave. So we really need to do something on a bigger order of magnitude. In 2009, we agreed pretty rapidly. It took about 6 months to get SDRs issued in a smaller amount, partly because the scale of the crisis was smaller. Now we need more, and we need to do it right now. The only argument I've really heard against doing SDRs now, it's interesting, this time we're not hearing arguments about the risk of provoking inflation, partly because even if we did issue 5 trillion of SDRs, the scale of that in terms of global trade and GDP would be pretty tiny, wouldn't provoke inflation, and obviously wouldn't provoke inflation in the context of a huge global economic downturn. The only argument I've heard being used in G20 and other discussions about this is we don't want country X or country Y to get access to these types of money that is cheap and no conditionality. Look, we've all been hit by a global pandemic. We all have governments that we dislike in this world who we would not particularly like to see getting money. But I hope that we all have massively more governments who we think, particularly if they're also being monitored, which nearly all of them are by other people like the IMF and the World Bank and everybody else for what they're doing with their budgets, will spend the money on producing economic stimulus and on fighting the terrible health and social protection consequences of this pandemic. People are starving now, people are dying of COVID now because there isn't money to treat them in developing countries, and it's going to get worse. And I do think that that trumps any idea of depriving one or two particular countries we don't like of money. We need to get the money to the 185 countries that need it right now who we do like. And I hope we can take that decision before we get to the G20 finance ministers meeting in July. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. And finally, Jean.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of the questions have been answered, and a lot of what I would have liked to say has been said. I'll respond to the question and merge it into my final remarks to say, first of all, this is an emergency of unprecedented scale. Indeed, there was an SDR issuance in 2009-2010, but the extent of the crisis we are currently facing, the extent of the human suffering that we are currently seeing, and the scale that it will have, and impact it will have on equality, and particularly on the direct impacts of women and girls, is unimaginable. So I think when we have a mechanism that is available to respond to the emergency need for financing, it seems unconscionable not to look at this and push ahead, especially considering that the potential technical arguments against that do not hold out compared to the need. I would say in terms of the issues of transparency, we acknowledge that the issue of financing this emergency is part of a broader discussion, a part of a broader financing for development agenda, in which issues of transparency, addressing loopholes, addressing illicit financial flows, addressing the massive bleed of resources out of developing countries is central and needs to be addressed. The global governance system to address illicit financial flows is not an optimal system, far from it. There are much more, there's much more that needs to be done than is currently on the table. And only if that is addressed can we really look at rebuilding the global financial system in a much more resilient and robust way, which would be needed. So with that, I will close and say thank you very much for this discussion.
Jean, thank you. In order, I think, just to offer some closing thoughts as well as next steps in terms of moving forward. I think all of our panelists today have gone over the extreme urgency of the current situation. As the IMF notes, the economic crisis is getting worse as we're seeing death rates grow across the developing world, as 265 million people now face famine and hunger around the world, meaning that we will have 1 billion people on planet Earth dealing with famine in the coming months. We need to immediately move forward action. And as our panelists described so clearly, one of the very few short-term immediate solutions we have is accessing the global reserves, the SDRs, the special drawing rights. So our advocacy and moving this forward is incredibly crucial right now. And there are some key dates that are coming up where our work together as civil society, the calls that the IMF has made, the United Nations have made to be able to move forward the special drawing rights, the calls from governments. Our work as civil society is crucial to move this forward now. We have in the third week of July, the G20 Finance Ministerial meeting, where many of these proposals will be discussed again. And the short-term issue of SDRs, of emergency global reserves, will be on the table. So our work over the coming weeks is absolutely important as we approach that. and note that a final decision on SDR issuance could be made in the October IMF and World Bank meetings, in the annual meetings. So we have these two crucial meetings coming up of the G20 in July, and then in October we have the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. We also expect a group that has taken a lot of action, in particular on debt, will be having its meetings in the fall, the G7. These issues will also be the chief issues discussed during the United Nations General Assembly. So we have these important moments that are coming up, and our advocacy is very important right now to continue to move forward the US government as well as the G20 in making the right decision on increasing an SDR issuance. At the US Treasury, we've seen a growing amount of focus on the SDRs and wanting to look at this issue, but the US Treasury, which is the most important group to move forward a decision, has not made a decision yet on the SDRs. We also know that there are several other countries within the G20 that have recently raised concerns. So global advocacy right now, in terms of moving the US government to the G20, is absolutely critical, both ahead of the G20 meetings coming up in July, as well as these urgent and critical fall IMF meetings, as well as the agenda of the UN General Assembly. In terms of additional advocacy, we ask all of you to join with us in this work and move it forward right now. Next week, we will have a global sign-on letter at jubileeusa.org on the special drawing rights. Jubileeusa.org, you can go and if you'd like to sign on to that and send a statement through that to the US Treasury, you will be able to use that process. I know that there were lots of other questions around advocacy. I would encourage you to go to the 4 groups' websites that we have for Eurodad, Afrodad, Latindadd, and Jubilee USA to get more information. If there are specific questions and questions you didn't feel were answered today, you can use the email contacts that were in the invitation, Latindadd at latindadd.org to follow up in Spanish, or CORD, C-O-O-R-D, at jubileeusa.org to follow up in English, and then we'll be able to circulate that among the global partners that are all working on these particular issues. And finally, as we close today, we also want to thank everyone for joining us in this conversation and being a part of this conversation with us today. Especially we want to thank our panelists, Jean, Patricia, Andreas, and Matthew for their incredible and crucial contributions today. In a very special way, we want to thank the translators. We've gotten lots of compliments during this session for the amazing work of Dia and Viviana. Thank you for being with us and doing the incredible job and tough job of interpretation with us today. We want to thank all the staffs, all the team members of Eurodad, Afrodad, Latindadd, and Jubilee USA Network who worked so hard to pull this event together, and the leadership of these particular groups. And finally, as we close today, I do want to offer a very special thank you for this work, the short-term work, the mid-term work, the long-term work we're doing on debt, on financial crisis solutions, on moving forward the SDRs to Eurodad, Afrodad, Latindadd, and Jubilee USA Network for propelling this work and sponsoring today's event. So thank you all for being with us, and we look forward to continue moving this forward, and we look forward to winning these global policies with you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much to everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.